My brother-in-law stole $200,000 from our family's company and stood in the kitchen making himself a smoothie while I sat across from his parents, signing my name to a confession letter until they realized I had one small habit from my very first week on the job that I never once thought to mention. The first time I walked into the offices of Callaway and Sons Construction, I wore a blazer I had ironed 3 times. I was 25, newly married to Ethan, and trying very hard to be the kind of daughter-in-law Gerald Callaway could be proud of. I had a degree in accounting from Ohio State. I had 4 years of private sector experience. I had a genuine desire to contribute something to the family I had married into. My father-in-law shook my hand with exactly enough warmth to remind me he was doing me a favor, showed me to a corner desk on the 2nd floor, and said, "Don't mess with what works." I didn't. For 3 years, I came in early and left late. I reconciled every vendor invoice within 48 hours. I flagged 2 billing discrepancies that saved the company nearly $30,000 in a single quarter. Pamela, my mother-in-law, acknowledged this exactly once at a Christmas dinner by saying I was thorough. I thanked her like she'd handed me an award. Derek was everything I wasn't in that family. He was loud where I was quiet. He was the one who walked into a room and made Gerald's face change, that particular brightening that fathers reserve for the child they actually recognize themselves in. Derek was 32, had an MBA from Vanderbilt, and had spent the past 8 months negotiating what the whole family called the Mercer deal, a $5.4 million acquisition of a regional materials supplier that would double Callaway and Sons' capacity overnight. Every Sunday dinner for 6 months had featured Derek at the head of the table, walking Gerald through projections and timelines, while I cleared plates and Ethan nodded along. I should have paid more attention to what Derek was doing when he wasn't in those meetings. On a Tuesday in March, I was running a routine reconciliation when I found it. A $210,000 transfer dated 2 Fridays prior, routed from our capital reserve account into a holding entity called Crestline Logistics, LLC. No corresponding invoice, no approval signature, no project code. I sat very still and stared at my screen. I pulled up Crestline Logistics. It had been incorporated 4 months earlier in Delaware. The registered agent was a law firm I didn't recognize. I cross-referenced our vendor database. Crestline didn't exist in it. I checked the wire authorization log. It had been processed under my login credentials. I hadn't authorized that transfer. I knew with absolute certainty that I had not, because I had been in Cincinnati that weekend visiting my mother, and I hadn't opened my laptop once. Someone had used my login. I made a single printed copy of everything I had found, folded it into my purse, and I went home that night and said nothing to Ethan. I know how that sounds. I want to be honest about it. I was afraid. I knew what I was looking at. I knew whose fingerprints were probably on it. And I knew exactly what happened to people in this family who created problems for Derek. 3 days later, Gerald called me into his office and closed the door. He was already seated behind his desk. Pamela was in the chair against the wall, which told me everything. When Pamela came to the office, it was never for good news. Derek was there too, standing near the window with his arms crossed, looking at me the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they're thinking of getting rid of. "We've completed an internal audit," Gerald said. "He didn't offer me a seat. We found an unauthorized transfer of funds. It came from your credentials." I looked at him steadily. "I know. I found it on Tuesday. I've been trying to figure out how to—" $210,000, Pamela said, as if I hadn't spoken. "Routed into a shell company. Maya, I want you to understand that we are choosing to handle this internally. We don't want the police involved. We don't want the courts involved. We especially don't want this involved in the Mercer closing, which happens in 11 days. I didn't do this," I said. The room didn't change. No one flinched. That was when I understood that this wasn't an investigation. This was already a verdict. "We have the system logs," Derek said from the window. His voice was almost sympathetic, which was somehow worse. "Your credentials, your IP address, your timestamp, the audit trail is clear." "Derek," I turned to look directly at him. "You know I was in Cincinnati that weekend." He shrugged. "Remote access is easy to set up. You could have been anywhere. Gerald placed a single sheet of paper on the desk and slid it toward me. What we need from you is simple. You sign this acknowledgement of responsibility. We keep it internal. We deduct restitution from your severance over a payment plan that won't leave you in financial hardship. You resign quietly. Ethan will remain unaffected. The family will remain intact. The Mercer deal closes on time. I looked at the paper. It was already prepared. It had my name on it in clean, official typeface. And if I don't sign? Gerald leaned back. He was a tall man, with the kind of permanent tan that comes from a lifetime of feeling like the most important person in every room. Then we involve our attorneys. We involve law enforcement. We prosecute for embezzlement, which means a criminal record, Maya. Which means Ethan will be forced to make a choice no husband should have to make. Which means this family's reputation goes through a very messy, very public proceeding right before the largest business deal in our company's history. We like you, Pamela said pleasantly. This is the version where everyone walks away. I thought about the printed copy in my purse. I thought about the fact that I was sitting in this room with 3 people who had clearly rehearsed this conversation, and not a single one of them was my husband. Where is Ethan? I asked. He's aware of the situation, Gerald said. He agrees this is the best path forward. Something cold moved through me. Not surprise. Just the settling of something I think I had been trying not to know for a long time. I looked at the paper again. I looked at Derek, who was inspecting his thumbnail with remarkable calm. I thought about 11 days. The Mercer deal. $5.4 million. I thought about what it would cost all of them if this came apart now. I thought about my first week at this company. I need until tomorrow morning, I said. Gerald studied me. You'll sign it tonight. I will sign nothing tonight, I said, and I kept my voice level the way you do when you're terrified and cannot afford to show it. I will be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow. You will have my answer then. He let me go. I think he thought I had nowhere to turn. Ethan was in the living room when I got home, sitting on the couch with the television on and the sound muted. He looked up when I came in, and the expression on his face told me he had known about this meeting before I walked into it. They showed me the audit, he said. Then you know I didn't do it. He was quiet for a long moment. The evidence is... Ethan, I sat down across from him. Look at me. Do you believe I did this? He couldn't hold my eyes. I believe that the Mercer deal is real money. I believe that if this goes public before the closing, we lose everything. Not just the deal. The company, the whole thing could unravel. So you want me to sign? He didn't answer. That was its own answer. I went to our bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against my knees and breathed until they stopped. I opened my laptop. On my first week at Callaway & Sons, before I touched a single vendor account, I had done the one thing any competent accountant does when they walk into a new financial environment they didn't build themselves. I installed a compliance monitoring tool. It was called Sentinel Ledger, a cloud-based system I had used at my previous firm. It ran quietly in the background, logging every transaction that moved through the accounts I administered, flagging anomalies, and automatically archiving a full daily snapshot to a secure off-site server registered to my personal professional email. A server that had nothing to do with Callaway & Sons' internal network, their IT department, or anyone in that family. I had set it up in my first 3 days and then, honestly, half forgotten about it. It required no maintenance. It just ran. Gerald had never asked about my setup process. Derek had never cared. Ethan didn't know what accounting software looked like. I opened the Sentinel Ledger portal. I navigated to the flagged transactions report. There it was. The $210,000 transfer, time-stamped to the minute. But Sentinel didn't just log what happened. It logged how it happened, which device, which IP, what authentication pathway was used to push the transaction through. My credentials had been used, yes, but they had been accessed via a spoofed session initiated from a device with a MAC address that did not match any computer I had ever logged in from. It matched, however, a device that had accessed our accounting platform from the Callaway & Sons executive suite exactly 6 times in the previous 4 months. Derek's office was in the executive suite. Sentinel had also done what it was designed to do with anything above a $50,000 threshold without a corresponding approval chain. It had automatically flagged the transaction and sent a summary report to my registered compliance contact. I had set that contact 3 years ago. It was a CPA named Richard Albrecht, who had been my supervisor at my previous firm, a man Gerald Calloway had never met and whose existence Derek had no reason to know about. I checked my archived emails. Richard had received the automated report on the Saturday after the transfer. He had replied to me with a note asking if this was an authorized transaction, and I, having been in Cincinnati and not yet aware of any of this, had never responded, which meant the report was sitting in his inbox, time-stamped, certified, and flagged as unresolved by a licensed independent CPA. I sat there for a long time looking at my screen. I thought about walking downstairs and showing Ethan all of this. I thought about what he had said. I believe the Mercer deal is real money, and I decided that right now, tonight, Ethan was not my ally. I forwarded the full Sentinel report, the device authentication log, and a brief explanatory note to Richard Albrecht's email. I asked him to hold on to it and to share it with no one unless he heard from me directly. Then I did one more thing. Gerald's attorney was a man named Vincent Lohr, whom I had met twice at company events. His firm's general intake email address was publicly listed on their website. I drafted a detailed email explaining the situation, attached the Sentinel data, and saved it as a draft. I set a scheduled send for 8:15 a.m. the next morning, 15 minutes after I was supposed to arrive at Gerald's office. If I walked in there and signed that paper, I would open my phone under the table and cancel the send. If things went another way, I would let it go. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to Ethan breathing beside me, and I thought about every Sunday dinner and every Christmas and every time I had ironed a blazer, trying to be enough for a family that had never once considered that I might be more than a liability they hadn't yet quantified. I was in Gerald's office at 8 o'clock exactly. Pamela was there again. Derek was not, which told me Gerald considered this already handled. There was fresh coffee on the credenza that no one offered me. Gerald placed the same paper on the desk. "I won't be signing this," I said. Gerald's expression didn't move. "I would encourage you to reconsider the consequences. I'd like to talk about a different set of consequences," I said. Specifically, the federal penalties for wire fraud and obstruction, and the professional consequences for a licensed CPA who certifies falsified records, which is what Mr. Sterling would be doing if he helped you file this agreement as a formal admission. Something shifted in Pamela's posture. Very small. A tightening. "I set up a compliance monitoring system on my first week here," I said. Sentinel Ledger. It archives every transaction I administer to a third-party server I control. Not your server. Not your network. Mine. I placed a printed copy of the device authentication report on his desk. The transfer was initiated from a device in the executive suite. "I don't have a desk in the executive suite." Gerald looked at the paper without picking it up. The flagged transaction report was automatically sent to an independent CPA 3 years ago when I first configured the system. He's had it in his inbox since the Saturday after the transfer. Time-stamped. Unresolved. Meaning there is already a third-party compliance record of this anomaly sitting outside your control. I paused. "I also have a scheduled email going to your attorney's firm in about 9 minutes, containing all of this." Gerald picked up the paper. He read it slowly. His face didn't collapse the way I had imagined it might. He was too controlled for that, but something behind his eyes went very quiet. The way a room goes quiet when someone has said something that cannot be unsaid. "You can still cancel that email," Pamela said. Her voice had changed. It was softer now, which somehow made it more frightening. "Maya, think about what you're doing. Think about Ethan." "I've thought about Ethan," I said. "I've thought about the fact that he sat on that couch last night and didn't once ask me if I was okay." I looked at her steadily. "I've thought about the fact that not one person in this family, in 3 years, asked me what I found before deciding I had done it." Gerald set the paper down. He folded his hands on the desk. "What do you want?" "I want the truth told to everyone it needs to be told to. I want Derek to answer for what he did, and I want my resignation processed with full severance and no defamation of my professional record." I reached into my bag and placed a second document on his desk. One I had printed at midnight, from the employee handbook I had read thoroughly in my first month. My employment contract includes a wrongful termination clause. If I'm separated from this company under false pretenses, the arbitration buyout is calculated at current company valuation divided by my equity stake. My equity stake, which your father-in-law gave me as a wedding gift and which I still hold, is 1.5%. I let him do the math. At current valuation, 1.5% was not a small number. Gerald stared at the document. Pamela made a sound I had never heard her make before. I checked my phone. 8:14 a.m. I'm going to step outside for 1 minute. I walked into the hallway and stood next to the water cooler. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. I looked at the draft email on my phone. My thumb hovered over cancel send. The office door opened. Gerald stood in the doorframe. He looked, for the first time in 3 years, like a man who had miscalculated something. Come back in, he said. I canceled the send. What followed was not a single dramatic moment. It was 3 weeks of attorneys and document exchanges and very tense silences in places that smelled like conference rooms. Derek's Crestline logistics account was traced and confirmed. He had been siphoning from the Capital Reserve over 4 months. Small enough amounts that routine audits wouldn't catch them. But Sentinel's anomaly triggers had flagged every one. He had moved the money to cover personal investment losses he had hidden from his father. The Mercer deal collapsed anyway. The acquiring company's legal team discovered the discrepancy during their due diligence review, which was already underway, and walked away from the table. Derek had destroyed the one thing he was trying to protect. Gerald did not press criminal charges against his own son. I understood this in a way that made me tired rather than angry. That was its own kind of consequence, having a father who would absorb this quietly, who would restructure and reorganize and never once hold the person he loved accountable in any way that cost them something real. Derek would be fine. Men like Derek are almost always fine. My severance was settled at a number that made my attorney do a small involuntary inhale when I showed her the equity clause. It was not $5 million, but it was enough. It was more than enough. Ethan and I sat in the kitchen of our house on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks after everything had resolved, and he told me he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they mean it, but also know that meaning it doesn't change the shape of what happened. I listened to him. I told him that I believed him. We sat there for a long time in the kind of quiet that isn't comfortable but is at least honest, which was more than we had managed in a long time. I don't know exactly what Ethan and I are to each other now. I think we are still figuring that out. I think some things you find out about a person during the hard moments cannot be unfound, and you have to decide what to do with that knowledge rather than pretending it isn't there. We are trying. Whether that is enough, I don't know yet. What I do know is this. On my last day in the Callaway & Sons office, I went to my corner desk and I packed my things into a single box. A framed photo, a coffee mug. 3 years of careful, meticulous, early morning work that had been someone else's invisible foundation. I uninstalled Sentinel Ledger from the company's accounting system. I archived my personal copy, neatly labeled, in a folder I keep backed up in 3 separate places. Old habit. Pamela passed me in the hallway on the way out. She didn't stop walking, but she looked at my box. And then she looked at me. And something in her expression shifted just slightly, not quite an apology, not quite respect, but something in the narrow territory between them. I carried my box out through the front door into a clear April morning, put it in the back seat of my car, and drove away. I had a lunch meeting with a recruiting firm at noon. My next job was already waiting. I had made sure of that. Some people spend years trying to prove their worth to a room that has already decided what they are. I had done that. I was done doing that. I drove with the windows down and the radio up, and I did not look back even once.